welcome into the Archetype Sports Business Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we're joined by author Alex Duff, who wrote a fantastic book called Le Fric about the Tour de France, about the history of the tour, the history of the ownership, how it started, how ownership changed over time, and how, events throughout history have had an effect on the tour and its marketability. It's a very interesting perspective, fantastic book. And so I'm happy that we were able to have him on to discuss that and other things. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Alex Duff. Joined here by Alex Duff, who wrote a fantastic book, Le Fric, about the Tour de France and about kind of the money and the history and the ownership over time, kind of a unique perspective. So thanks a lot for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
What made you write this book?
Well, in a previous job, I worked for Bloomberg, and I persuaded Bloomberg to let me cover the Tour de France for a few years. As you would expect, the remit for Bloomberg reporters is follow the money. And so one of my jobs was to find out, okay, who's getting rich from the Tour de France? And, it turned out that this quite secretive family called the Amories, who had owned the race since the end of the Second World War. And I think at the time I'd never heard of them. I had heard of the organization ASO, which is the Amory Sport Organization, but I didn't know anything about who owned that. And so, I started to dig into the story. And so that's how it all started. And I wrote, I think, a few articles about them, or about the business of the Tour de France while I was working for Bloomberg, but I still felt that I didn't know the whole story. And so that was why I decided to do the book.
Sure. So I guess tell us a little bit about that. How did you said they owned it, post World War II. How exactly did the tour come about? And, who sort of started it and owned it before that?
Right. Well, it was originally launched by a newspaper, a sports newspaper in France called L'Auto, which means the car. And it was a sports newspaper that covered motor racing, but they also covered cycling, and they wanted to increase their sales. And they thought with a bicycle race around France, it would capture, well, at least some people in the newsroom thought it was a good idea. It would capture the imagination of the French people and sell newspapers. And the concept, in fact, worked very well. It was like a sort of summer soap opera, and people used to read about it every day, what was happening in the tour. It was almost like in those days they used to serialize novels in newspapers, and you get a different extract every weekday or every week. And the Tour de France sort of fitted that mold. It was like an ongoing novella where different stuff would happen every day, and you'd have your heroes and the villains, and usually the heroes were the French riders, and the villains could have been the Italians or some, anyone else who wasn't deemed a favorite of the locals. And so that's how it started, and it grew very fast. And at the time of the Second World War, it was stopped, the tour, because of the German invasion. The German occupied the northern part of France, and the race didn't go ahead. But the guy who had inherited the race before the war still continued to publish L'Auto newspaper during the war, and because of this, he was sort of stripped of the ownership of the title, because as part of the remit for publishing. He had to publish Nazi propaganda, about the war. So he was stripped of the ownership,
And that was frowned upon by France post World War.
Exactly, yeah. And anyone, and everybody who had published newspapers during the German occupation was kicked out. So there were many sort of newspapers which had no ownership, no editor, and so there was a sort of complete reboot of the newspaper industry. And as part of this reboot, this guy called Emilion Almori, who was hadn't been in newspapers but was in the advertising business, he took control of the sort of replacement newspaper, the replacement sports newspaper, which was called L'Equipe, which still exists today. And he, because of his government contacts and his contacts in the French resistance, he was powerful enough to sort of, even though he didn't have lots of money, he was powerful enough to sort of ease into position of ownership of this new sports title, which he sort of ran with the former editor of L'Auto, who had been disgraced, a guy called Jacques Godet. And so they went into partnership. Almori was the front man because he had the contacts, and Godet was sort of behind the scenes because he knew how to run newspapers and he knew how to run the Tour de France. And so they sort of, that's how it began, the Almori's ownership of the race. It was a sort of a political move by Emilion Almori, and he became a successful newspaper magnate in the years after the war. He owned several major titles, including L'Equipe. And eventually he bought out Jacques Godet and became the sole owner of both L'Equipe and the Tour de France.
And we know now it's kind of the golden goose in I guess on the cycling calendar. At the time, or pre-World War, post-World War, was it profitable in and of itself, or just help sell papers, or what was kind of the structure of the tour, maybe at that time coming out of World War II?
Yeah, it didn't make her any money. It was a money loser, partly because the team, the organizers, paid for pretty much everything. They paid for the bikes of the teams, they paid for their hotels, they paid for their food and their drinks. And there wasn't, obviously, as of today, there's no ticket income. The only income was from sponsorships. And that wasn't enough to cover the costs. So it was basically loss making. But the newspaper, because they sold, I seem to remember that they could double their sales during the tour. I don't remember the exact figures, but it certainly,
it had a big effect on the paper
it made
sales.
up. Yeah. It was worthwhile in terms of extra newspaper sales. So it was sort of written off as marketing expenses by the newspaper, and they continued to bankroll it. So it was only in the age of television when it really became interesting from an economic point of view in terms of making money by itself.
So was that the big change, television, or what were there different sponsorship things, or was it really just that move to television and having that large broadcasting product that made it sort of move into the profitable enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, it really was television, which was the game changer, not only in terms of broadcast income, but also in terms of the sponsors you could attract, because you have, with global television audience, you could attract bigger sponsors. So they attracted, whereas before it was predominantly French sponsors, in the 80s, they began to attract sponsors like Coca-Cola and big multinational companies who were interested in the global reach that cycling had. Those TV was definitely there was definitely before and after for the Tour de France, and in terms of the finances after TV, they're just much more interesting in terms of revenue generation.
And that all of those changes took place under the Armory family. They owned it that whole time and even through to now, right?
Yes.
Or,
So
yeah.
so they took full control of the race in the 1965, and the sort of the guy who instigated the first owner, he died in the 70s, and he passed it on to his son. There was a dispute between his son and his daughter over who would get all his assets. Eventually, they managed to settle out of court, and the son got the right to the L'Équipe newspaper and the Tour de France, and he carried it on during the TV era, and then his widow, who's still alive, and she's now in her 80s, took it over from him, and today she runs the business with her two children. So it's sort of almost onto the third generation of owners now.
Sure.
I mean, they're pretty much the third generation is now pretty much in control, and there's no sign of them wanting to relinquish the Tour de France.
And what so like what was the relationship with the French government over all of this time? It's kind of like the national race, it's their national jewel, it's done a lot for tourism. Was there a relationship with like, or is there a relationship with the French government and the Armory family and that kind of stuff, or how has that fleshed out over the years?
Yeah, I mean the Armory family has always been quite close to the government because they need the government to make the race happen. You know, the government is the one who has the power to shut down the roads to let the Tour pass through. You know, without government permission, the Tour wouldn't exist. So the family tries very hard to maintain good relations with the government, and the government understands the value of the Tour de France. You know, it's worth it must be worth a fortune in advertising dollars, because you have all those wonderful helicopter shots of the French countryside, French chateaux, and some people tune in just to watch the countryside.
Oh
they
yeah,
don't tune
for
in
sure.
for
For sure.
the racing. They tune into to sort of
It's like having a baseball game on in the background. You've got the early
yeah
morning stage and the
yeah
first couple hours of the stage, it's basically mostly chateaus and mountainsides.
yeah. I mean, and it's yeah. I don't know what the audience is in the early afternoon in Europe, but people have it on to people turn it on in the bars, and so it's on. That's sort of almost like free advertising for the French tourism industry, and so therefore the government is happy to close the roads. They're happy to make an effort to put this race on every July, and there's sort of a symbiotic relationship between the government and this family to keep the Tour a major summer sporting event. Now, when the sort of doping scandals of the 90s and the 2000s happened, the race was, you could argue, was under threat, that it may just collapse under the weight of the scandals. But both the family and the government were very keen to maintain what is a unique, virtually unique piece of sporting heritage, and they worked hard to make sure that it carried on. The government carried on bankrolling the race through TV income, because the race is on public TV in France. They carried on, sponsoring the race through government entities. The French sponsors also, French banks, carried on their sponsorship. So there was like a sort of coming together of all the French establishment to make sure that the race didn't go under and that it could continue.
And did the doping, did that, like, I guess it sort of ultimately codified that relationship even more going forward? I mean, did the sort of whole doping situation and the French maybe taking it a little more by the book than the other teams and other riders, what kind of effect did that have on, I guess, like that government armory relationship as compared to the other more international uh, stakeholders or players, I guess?
Well, it kind of, the biggest scandal arguably was the one which was most disruptive to the race itself during the race was the 1998 Festina affair, when there were like drug raids, on team hotels virtually every day or every other day, and some media pulled out of the race, some teams pulled out. There was some fears that the race wouldn't reach Paris, and as a result of that scandal, the French introduced new legislation which made doping a criminal offence, and if you were caught doping, there was a risk that you could face a prison sentence. And from that moment on, the French team figured, okay, it's not really worth the risk anymore of doping, because not only are we going to anger our fans even more,
You might go to jail.
exactly, we might go to jail. So the French teams pretty much stopped doping, whereas the teams based outside France, they still train across the border in Spain, and there was no risk of getting into serious trouble. You might fail a doping test at worst, but even then, the sort of punishments for that were relatively minor, and at that point, you could still get away with it. So everybody, not everybody, but the people who were doping before, a lot of them carried on. Some of them stopped, but some of them carried on, and so that sort of marked the division between the French teams and the other teams, and there was lots of tension because the French teams were angry that they perceived foreign teams to carry on cheating.
Sure, yeah.
And so that developed a rift between both sides.
They were sort of competing in their own country, but felt, these guys can do something I can't do, basically.
Exactly, yeah. And the difference doping can make to performance is tremendous. So, you could be training for 365 days a year and putting in immense effort to be as good as you can, and you'll still get slaughtered because somebody else was taking EPO, and that can just...
And it's a month-long race. You can't...
Yeah.
It's hard to,
yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you can imagine how unfair that some of those French riders felt about it, about how they were getting beaten.
So the race, it probably never will be sold, but could it really ever be sold to kind of a foreign owner or something like that? Or because it sort of needs that French government support and French support, or is that not an accurate take?
I think the government would be very reluctant to sell it to a non-French owner. I think it would be a little bit of a scandal. I mean, today, like, sports entities are owned by different organizations all around the world, so it wouldn't be completely unexpected, but given the French are probably a bit more protective about their cultural heritage than many countries, I think it would cause quite a uproar in the government, among politicians, among certain members of the French public. So I don't think it would be easy to do. A takeover would be, you have to do a lot of diplomatic work to make sure that that could get off the ground. You probably have to have some French, French allies on your side to make it takeover work.
And as far as, so we touched on it a little bit, but I don't know if we explicitly said it. The tour kind of being that golden goose on the calendar, and they, the Armory family makes a lot of money from the tour, and basically that the TV money is theirs, correct? For all the broadcasting of the tour. Have there been? I mean, you see it in other sports. Have there been attempts, by the teams or by other stakeholders to try to get some of that TV money that basically represents a large percentage of the seasonal TV money for the sport?
Yeah, there's been a number of sort of semi-covert attempts by teams to rebel against the current business model. These are sort of, some of them have been behind closed doors and in secret, because the teams are very worried about sort of being left exposed. They realize that they need the Tour de France, they need to be at the Tour de France to keep their sponsors happy, and to get the sponsorship dollars rolling in every year. So they've definitely thought about it. They've definitely plotted at some occasions. There's even been talk of a strike to try and shift the business model, but ultimately those sort of rebellions have petered out because the teams, there's not much unity amongst the teams, and there's always the fear that the French would just invite French teams and even French amateur teams, if necessary. They would still run the race without these foreign teams, if really necessary. So that, basically the foreign teams don't really have much negotiating power, and that has so far meant that there hasn't been a sustained or effective attempt to change the business model.
Well, I know you mentioned a couple other sports in the book, which I've seen as well. But you mentioned Wimbledon and them kind of sitting out, and they still ran the event, but the champion was kind of like a far diminished champion. And obviously Formula One, it was a huge battle to kind of wrangle back some of that power from the manufacturer teams. And it wasn't pretty, but it ultimately kind of worked in a sense, and they packaged their TV deals, and all of the teams got rich, even though it was a kind of a cobbled together agreement. So you don't think, even if, say, some of the teams sat out and, there were 3 or 4 French teams for that year, you think maybe over time riders would just be forced to ride on those French teams, or would it be powerful enough that you'd have the kind of the Wimbledon effect, and they'd realize they need the top tier talent, or maybe people aren't going to watch as much?
I mean, I suppose the difference with the Tour de France is it's so much more important than the other races.
Sure.
That, it's so hard for those teams to miss. If it was more,
even for a year,
in Formula One, you have like the Monaco Grand Prix as the sort of blue ribbon event, but there are many other races, and so the teams, if they wanted to sit out the Monaco Grand Prix for the season, it's possible they could do that. Or if the top tennis players wanted to sit out Wimbledon and they could still play in the US Open and the French Open. So I think that's because the tour has become such an important, it's so much more important than the other races. That means it is more difficult for the teams to miss, and the strike is just, almost unthinkable for most of them. The other thing is that they're never very united. Well, they're always, by nature, they're competing against each other, and they're distrustful of each other, and so there isn't kind of much sort of team spirit in terms of how they would sort of take on the Amory family.
Yeah, yeah, they're kind of competing against each other on the road and competing against each other for sponsorship dollars, and a lot of their sponsors are kind of, short term, for the team itself, and sitting out for that a year might just not be an option.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a hand to mouth existence. They can barely. Sometimes they can barely keep going from one year to the other, and they don't have the time or the energy to take on another battle of that size.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you see, even after a successful season, they're sort of fighting for sponsorship, and maybe, they're selling used bikes, depending on their bike agreement. And, that's just at the top tier of the sport. You don't really see that other places.
No, I mean,
with that kind.
Exactly. There's no regular income. They don't have that guaranteed income that you would get in many sports. You have to generate that income year on year, and it's it's tricky to get sponsors. It can take months and months, and teams close down all the time.
Sure.
It's normal for teams to shut down.
So the kind of the ownership, probably won't change in that kind of dynamic, but do you see other changes potentially going forward? I mean, there's been changes throughout the ownership of the Armory family. Do you see, maybe different ways of commercialization, or maybe, any kind of changes in the future of the sport, or kind of continuing on as it has been the last decade or so?
Well, I fear that it's a little bit outdated. The length of the stages. So you have this difficulty about maintaining the history and the heritage, but trying to keep it relevant to a modern audience, a young audience. And how are you going to persuade, millennials to watch a 4 or 5 hour stage when everything? Most other sports are like getting
Couple
cutting
hours.
the time.
Yeah.
They're making
that TV product. Yeah.
So it's a tough one. I mean, it's interesting that there's going to be a Netflix series about the tour this summer, which was filmed at last year's tour. So hopefully that will elevate some of the characters to a new audience.
And do you know, just on that, do you know how that money's divided up, or is that going to the teams, or to the Armory family?
Yeah, my understanding is that the teams get a small amount for their participation. Okay. So they gave behind scenes access to the production company. I'm not sure if the Amory family also gets a fee. I don't know. I would imagine they would be delighted with the coverage.
Mm-hmm. I thought you were going to say delighted with the fee, but yes, the coverage too.
Yeah. I mean, I think the coverage would be enough for them, but maybe they negotiated the fee as well. I don't know. But the hope is that will be successful in bringing in new audience, and I guess it's about the beauty of the Tour de France is the history and all that's gone before.
Sure.
And I think that has to be explained to new generations every year. Otherwise, the race sort of may just fade as time goes by.
All right. Well, that's all I've got. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for coming on. So the book Fric that you wrote has a lot more information in it. Where can people get that if they want to read it?
Yeah, you well. Thanks very much for your time, Curtis. Nice to talk. You can get the book on Amazon. I think I'm not in the US. I think it's only available for now on as an ebook. I don't. There's no US edition at the moment, but you can get it. You can download it on Kindle, and you can buy it on Amazon.com.
Okay.
And it should be out in paperback this year. So yeah, you Google it, Le Fric, Alex Duff, and you should see it on Amazon.
And that's
yeah.
Lefric, right?
Yeah, Le Fric,
Yeah.
which means it's French slang word for the money, the cash.
Okay.
The idea
Perfect.
was to give it the idea is it's like a business history of the tour, but it's quite hopefully fun to read. It's not too heavyweight reading. It's supposed to be like a breezy read through the history of the race.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, I've enjoyed reading it. It is fascinating, and it is an easy read. So thank you so much for coming on.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me, Curtis.
Thank you.